Hello, this is BritJet's PSX Tips, the Aerowinks PSX 747 desktop simulation, and today I'm going to be talking about one engine inoperative approaches. With one engine inoperative, there are differences between two engines and four engines. Management: two engines would be a mayday, land at the nearest airport. 747, no need for a mayday. You might be able to carry on with your scheduled flight. So it's a much more relaxed operation on the 747. Handling of the failure: two-engine aircraft, there'll always be quite a lot of rudder needed. It'll always be the same amount, left or right. Jumbo, of course, an inboard failure is actually hardly noticeable. An outboard failure, you've still got lots of rudder authority because the 747 rudder is there to fly if two engines are failed on the same side. So the handling will vary on the 747 slightly, but it's never excessive. In terms of performance, twins and four-engine jets all have lots of performance these days with big engines. A twin might be restricted on the amount of flap it can land with. A four-engine aircraft like the 747, there is no restriction on how much flap you use. The 747, therefore, is a much more relaxed aircraft to fly with an engine inoperative, and in fact, as I'm sure you know, there are three-engine ferry flights taking place all over the world all the time for aircraft that have lost an engine for some reason and landed, so they'll be taking off and landing normally with an engine inoperative. Having said that it's a doddle and nice and easy, let's go on to look at some of the things that we would have to think about specifically for a 747. So what can we do? Well, just about everything is normal, as you can see here. A full Cat 3C auto land, that is no decision height provided the airport is so equipped, and most operators will actually recommend their crews do an auto land for an engine failure simply because they might never have done one for real. Although you'll probably know that for check rides, pilots have to demonstrate that they can land the aircraft manually with an engine failed. Normal crosswind limits apply. You may see different figures on this, but the 747-400 can land within the normal crosswind guidelines, the maximum guidelines. Normal amount of flap you would normally use for that runway, so 25 or 30. Of course, there may be a thrust change depending on how much flap you choose to use. And a normal landing VREF, the normal VREF for the flap. All of this means the normal landing distance, of course, although you will find that Boeing directs you to a graph in the QRH for landing distance with one engine inoperative. In fact, this landing distance is pretty well identical to the four engines case. Normal braking available, auto brakes, manual, whatever you require, and normal reverse, so idle, partial or full reverse as you would normally use for that runway. Normal then. A lot of pilots think they've got to do something extra if an engine's failed, so they'll stamp on the brakes, put a bit more auto brake on, have a bit more reverse, anything for mum basically, but none of that is necessary. That's just paranoia creeping in. The airplane can carry out a normal landing. What we can't do is land on a runway with poor braking action, if that landing distance is limiting, which is likely to be. And the reason for that one is simply for the certification of the aircraft. If the braking action is poor, you have to have two symmetrical reversers available. So if you land and a reverser fails on the failed engine side, you've no longer got that. So for that reason, you're not allowed to land on poor braking action. The other thing is, of course, you can't fly an RA, should that be necessary, but your transponder should be in TA mode anyway. So that's it, it's a normal operation. Having said that, there are a few things to think about. Let's go on and have a look at those. Here's a frozen shot of a manually flown Flap 25 landing on short final, just to show a few points. First of all, the handling of the thrust levers. In this case, I've closed the failed engine thrust lever. It will then follow the others around on a cam like that, or you can have them all lined up, it's your choice. The thrust itself on the engines, 1.15 EPA would be the nominal thrust setting for this 250 ton aeroplane. 0.07 on top of that for the failure gives you 1.22, and as you can see here I've got a little bit more than that. Now depending on the mod status of PSX and how things are fine-tuned, you may find the thrust settings will differ slightly, and here I've got 1.27. Just give it what it needs, but it's pretty close. The low and slow indication I've got on the PFD here is something to watch out for. You see the speed has bled back to VREF and we're getting a little low. So always avoid that situation. Don't allow it to get out of control, or you'll be putting on an awful lot more thrust to recover it. While we're looking at the PFD, notice the balance indicator at the top. Now Boeing recommends that to be in balance for an approach like this, the balance indicator should be slightly out to the right, in this case towards the live engines, very slightly. In terms of the balance, you can see top left there's some rudder deflected, but not very much, and the rudder trim bottom right there you can see is just over 4 divisions, which is what you'd probably expect for this slightly higher approach setting. So that's how we expect it to look on final approach. So what do we have to think about? Well, align all 4 thrust levers throughout or leave the failed one closed, it's up to you. Now throughout the procedure you must always make sure you are in balance, so keep looking at your primary flight display. Whether or not you have the autopilot or the auto throttle engaged, it doesn't matter. Until you get to multi-channel, if you ever get there, the rudder is up to you. The autopilot will not control the rudder unless it is land 3 or land 2. We're going to use the rudder trim as well, typically 3 to 4 units for an outboard failure, and we'll leave the rudder trim in for landing. This means that when you close the thrust levers in the flare, the rudder trim will take over and will yaw the aircraft towards the live engine, which might seem rather strange, but we have to be ready for that and keep straight in the landing. Now the whole idea of any engine out approach is to fly with minimum thrust changes. So we will be flying a specific approach profile which we'll look at presently. You'll need extra thrust on all engines, typically 0.07 EPA on an RB211, but basically give it what it needs. Remember the auto rudder on land 3, land 2. If you have land 3 or land 2, the flight system will be handling the rudder channel itself in preparation for a full auto land. So don't change the rudder trim if you have land 3 or land 2, and there are considerations to this when we come to do a go around and come out of multi-channel as well. But we'll discuss this when we talk about the go around later. Here we are on the approach then, and the balance indicator there is the white rectangle. To be in balance, it must be right underneath the white triangle. Now if we increase thrust like this, you'll see the indicator moves to the right. So to correct that, we need to increase our right rudder slightly, so I'll do that. Just give us a little bit more right rudder there to get the indicator back into the center just slightly, and let it settle down. Now having done that, it would be nice to get it trimmed as well. So on the rudder trim itself, we can increase the rudder trim like this, just slightly, remembering to relax the rudder pressure at the same time. And if we've done it right, it'll be back in trim. Now if we throttle back like this, the opposite is going to happen. Ball moves to the left, the balance to the left. So reduce our rudder slightly, get it to settle, and then on the rudder trim again, we are going to reduce the rudder trim like this, remembering to relax our rudder pressure at the same time to get it in the center. So if we fly a whole approach doing this all the time, it can get very complicated. We want to fly the approach as far as possible without having to do this many times. And the best way to do that is to fly a particular profile where we change thrust as little as we can. So the Boeing profile is like this. As you approach the airport, flap 5 and then flap 10, try not to change the thrust, let the speed come back with the drag of the flaps to the correct speed bug. On the localizer then, once the glide slope comes alive, at 1 dot or thereabouts, select the gear down and the flap 20 together. And as you hit glide slope green, select your landing flap. Now the idea of those two maneuvers is to get the drag to get the speed correct as you go down the glide slope without having to throttle back a great deal. It's up to you how you time it. These are recommendations. 1 dot, for example, might be 1.5 dots if you were very low and the glide slope was coming in quickly, or if you had a tailwind or something like that. So make the appropriate judgment. And then down the ILS. And of course, if you have rudder trim in as recommended, then you'll have to think about what's going to happen to the nose as you close the thrust levers. You don't have to have rudder trim in for the approach, but it will make things a lot easier if you have to carry out a go-around. So as you approach the runway, make sure you've got a good idea in your head about the sort of things you're going to have to do with your rudder in the event of a landing or a go-around. Okay, we're going to Barbados. We're going to fly an ILS approach with manual thrust to illustrate the point that we can transition down the glide slope without changing the thrust. Here we are at flap 5 and I've got 1.29 EPA. So keep an eye on the EPAs as we make the approach and I'll let the video run. Very shortly now I'm going to select flap 10. I've left this a little late for the sake of brevity on the video. You could do this earlier. There's flap 10 and bugging the 10 bug as well. The speed will come back quite slowly. That's absolutely fine. Don't let the speed get slow. Don't be afraid to change the thrust if need be. But for the purposes of this demo, I'm going to leave the thrust exactly where it is now, which is 1.27, which was my datum thrust from a previous flight. So this should work. Now the glide slope is now active, and once we get to 1 dot, we're going to go gear down, flap 20. There we go. At 1 dot, gear down, flap 20 selected, bug back to the 20, thrust stays the same, and the next thing will be glide slope intercept, which will be landing flap. We have it. I'm just waiting for the flap because my gear is still transiting. There goes the landing flap, and the bug back to VREF +5. And down we go. No change to thrust, no change to rudder. Now, of course, at the moment we are using manual rudder and manual rudder trim. If you are coupled to an ILS with the autopilot, then of course below 1500 feet you are going to get multi-channel if you get land 3 or land 2. So as we approach 1500 feet now, we will get the annunciation and then we will be multi-channel like that. Now the autopilot is handling the rudder. You can change the rudder trim on the pedestal to any setting you like. It will make no difference to how the autopilot flies the aircraft. However, if you take the autopilot out, then that rudder trim of course becomes active, which could be highly embarrassing if you've got it in the wrong place. You can see the airplane is nice and stable on the approach, +5 on the speed, and we haven't changed a thing on the thrust. I would let the airplane carry on and do an automatic landing, but in practice, for the sake of the video, we'll stop it there. Just to briefly discuss the go-around, same thing with multi-channel. If you are multi-channel and you hit go-around, you get toga. As any of those togas become another mode, then the rudder is no longer protected. You will be back on manual rudder. So if you take a vertical mode or a horizontal mode from multi-channel, then you lose your rudder and you'll have to do it yourself. So be very careful about that. Of course, if you're not using multi-channel, then it will be manual throughout. Okay, yours truly is going to fly a manual go-around now to demonstrate. The diagram at the top shows you what's going to happen. Go around flap 20, hit the toga switches, rotate the aircraft manually up towards the flight director and feed in the rudder as you go as the thrust increases. Positive climb, gear up and away you go. Watch your pitch attitude, don't let the pitch get too high. That's not too bad. And then when we get to 400 feet, engage a lateral mode. At 1000 feet, our well-known flight level change, speed 190 knots, and clean the aircraft up to flap 5 as we pass the bugs. You'll see there's a note there about approaching level off, disconnect auto throttle to prevent destabilization. If you decide to manually fly this thing throughout, what happens is, as you lower the nose to level off, the auto throttle will reduce the thrust to keep the speed, and you finish up lowering the nose, it reduces the thrust, you lower the nose more, it reduces the thrust more, and you never get to your level off. So it's a good idea to have manual thrust if you're manually leveling off. But I'm going to put the autopilot in for the level off because I'm lazy. Okay, let's fly this and we'll see what happens. So starting from approaching the minima, our minima 400 feet. There we go around flap 20. Thank you, Sarah. Rotating, keeping in balance, feeding in a little bit of rudder. Positive climb. If I can reach the gear lever. Gear up. 400 feet, LNAV. And away we go. Adjust your balance, follow the director. Next thing will be 1,000 feet above the ground in the case of this particular go-around for the acceleration. There we go, flight level change, pressing speed and dialing 190 knots. I've put the autopilot in. Passing the 10 bug, selecting flap 10. Passing the 5 bug, selecting flap 5, and we have acquired the altitude. Remember your manual rudder throughout, so make sure the aircraft stays in balance as you level off. And that is a one engine inoperative go-around.